My name is Elena Voss. I am 38 years old. For 15 years, I have served as Chief Linguistic Analyst for the International Diplomatic Corps, fluent in 12 languages, including Mandarin, Arabic, Russian, Portuguese, Hindi, German, French, Japanese, Korean, Swahili, Italian, and Spanish. I have translated peace treaties that prevented wars, interpreted emergency negotiations that saved thousands of lives, and decoded communications that exposed international conspiracies most people will never hear about. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. But the most devastating betrayal I ever faced didn't come from foreign adversaries or diplomatic enemies. It came from my own brother, David, the person who was supposed to believe in me the most. And it happened during the most critical 48 hours of my career, when a single mistranslation could have triggered a conflict that would have reshaped the global economy and cost millions of lives. You see, David never saw me as anything more than just a translator. To him, I was the quiet sister who hid behind books and languages while he built his empire in international finance. He was the CEO of Meridian Global Investments, commanding boardrooms in New York, London, and Singapore. I was, in his words, someone who repeats what other people say. He never understood that words don't just carry meaning. They carry the power to build bridges or burn them down. The crisis began on a Tuesday morning in Geneva, during what should have been routine trade negotiations between the Krasnoyan Federation and the Allied Economic Consortium. I was there as the primary interpreter, one of only 3 people in the world qualified to handle the complex technical and cultural nuances between these two economic superpowers. The stakes couldn't have been higher. A $847 billion trade agreement that would affect global supply chains, energy prices, and the economic stability of 17 nations. David was there too, representing a consortium of investment firms that would profit immensely from the successful completion of these talks. He barely acknowledged my presence that morning, greeting me with his usual dismissive nod before turning his attention to what he considered the important people in the room. What he didn't know, what nobody knew except me, was that I had been secretly monitoring encrypted communications between several parties for weeks. My linguistic expertise wasn't just about translation. It was about pattern recognition, cultural analysis, and understanding the subtle ways people reveal their true intentions through language. And what I had discovered was terrifying. Someone was deliberately sabotaging the negotiations, not through force or obvious manipulation, but through the most insidious weapon of all, mistranslation. Tiny, almost undetectable changes in meaning that would slowly poison the talks and ensure their failure. Changes that would trigger economic chaos, destabilize currencies, and potentially lead to the kind of international tensions that historically preceded major conflicts. The mastermind was brilliant, choosing words and phrases that sounded correct to casual observers, but carried hidden implications that would gradually turn allies into enemies. They had infiltrated the translation services, corrupted backup interpreters, and even planted false linguistic consultants among the support staff. It was a conspiracy designed to fail slowly, creating maximum confusion and chaos, while leaving no obvious fingerprints. But they made one critical mistake. They underestimated what it means to truly understand language. Not just vocabulary and grammar, but the cultural DNA embedded in every phrase, the historical weight of every metaphor, the emotional resonance of every choice of words. They thought they could fool everyone because they understood the mechanics of language. They had no idea that some of us don't just speak languages, we live them, breathe them, dream in them. I had discovered their plan purely by accident 3 weeks earlier. While reviewing preliminary documents, I noticed inconsistencies in the Russian translations that seemed strange. Not wrong enough to be obvious errors, but subtly off in ways that would create misunderstandings down the line. Curious, I cross-referenced them with the Chinese and Arabic versions. The patterns became unmistakable. Someone was systematically introducing linguistic poison into every major communication channel. The realization hit me like ice water. This wasn't incompetence. This was warfare, conducted through carefully weaponized words. I spent the next 21 days conducting my own investigation, using my access to international linguistic databases, cultural archives, and communication records. What I discovered was a network spanning 4 continents, involving corrupted translators, bribed cultural consultants, and software specifically designed to introduce plausible errors into automated translation systems. The sophistication was breathtaking and terrifying. The goal was elegant in its simplicity: create enough miscommunication to ensure the trade talks would collapse in mutual accusations and distrust. The economic fallout would benefit a small group of investors who had positioned themselves to profit from global instability. Currency speculation, commodity manipulation, defense contracting, they had built an empire designed to thrive on international chaos. And my brother David's firm was at the center of it all. That Tuesday morning in Geneva, as I sat in the interpreter's booth watching the opening ceremonies, I carried the weight of knowledge that could either save or destroy everything. I knew who was behind the sabotage. I knew how they planned to execute it. I knew the exact moment when their linguistic time bomb was scheduled to detonate. What I didn't know was how to stop it without destroying my own family in the process. Because the evidence I had gathered pointed to an uncomfortable truth. David wasn't just a beneficiary of the conspiracy. He was one of its architects. The brother who called me just a translator had been using my own expertise against me, feeding information about linguistic vulnerabilities to people who would weaponize that knowledge for profit.
But he had made the same mistake as his co-conspirators. He thought he understood language because he could speak 3 languages fluently and conduct business in 5 more. He thought translation was just about converting words from one language to another. He had no idea that true linguistic mastery means understanding the spaces between words, the silence between syllables, the cultural earthquakes that can be triggered by a single misplaced phrase. In 48 hours, his carefully constructed plan would begin its execution. The first mistranslation was scheduled to occur during the economic framework discussions. A single phrase in Krasnerian that would be deliberately misinterpreted to suggest territorial ambitions rather than trade partnerships. The resulting confusion would cascade through every subsequent negotiation, poisoning trust and ensuring failure. But I had something he didn't expect. I had the one thing that his conspiracy couldn't account for. A sister who understood that words don't just carry meaning, they carry responsibility. And I was about to show him exactly what 12 languages could do when wielded by someone who refused to let greed destroy the peace. The question wasn't whether I could stop the conspiracy. The question was whether I could do it without destroying what was left of my family. Because sometimes the most dangerous enemies are the ones who share your blood, and sometimes the most important battles are fought not with weapons, but with words that carry the power to reshape the world. David thought he knew me. He thought I was just a translator. He was about to learn that in the right hands, languages aren't just tools of communication, they're weapons of truth. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now, back to the story. The first sign of trouble came at exactly 9:47 a.m., during the opening address by Minister Alexander Volkov of the Krasnerian Federation. I was seated in the interpreter's booth, headphones adjusted, my hands poised over the microphone controls, when I heard something that made my blood run cold. Minister Volkov was speaking in rapid, formal Russian about ukreplenie ekonomicheskие связи, strengthening economic ties. But the official translation being broadcast to the consortium delegates said something entirely different, expanding territorial influence through economic leverage. The difference was subtle enough that most people wouldn't catch it, but devastating enough to plant seeds of suspicion in every mind in that room. I looked down at the main floor of the Geneva International Conference Center, watching the faces of the Allied Economic Consortium representatives. I could see the micro-expressions shifting, raised eyebrows, sideways glances, the almost imperceptible stiffening of postures that indicated alarm. They were hearing a threat where Volkov was offering partnership. My hands trembled slightly as I reached for my emergency override button. As Chief Linguistic Analyst, I had the authority to interrupt any translation if I detected critical errors. But before I could press it, my supervisor's voice crackled through my private channel. Elena, maintain protocol. Do not interrupt the primary translation feed. I froze. Dr. Heinrich Brenner had been my supervisor for 8 years. He'd never given me a direct order to ignore translation errors. Never. I stared at his position across the room, trying to catch his eye, but he was deliberately avoiding my gaze. Dr. Brenner, I whispered into my mic, there's been a significant mistranslation. Minister Volkov. I said, maintain protocol, Voss. That's an order. My heart was pounding now. Dr. Brenner knew Russian as well as I did. There was no way he hadn't caught the error, which meant this wasn't an error at all. It was intentional. I watched in growing horror as the cascade effect began. The consortium's lead negotiator, Ambassador Patricia Hartwell, was already scribbling notes with sharp, aggressive strokes. The energy in the room had shifted from cautious optimism to guarded hostility. On the Krasnerian side, Minister Volkov continued speaking, completely unaware that his words of friendship were being twisted into threats. David, sitting in the third row, leaning back in his chair with that satisfied expression I'd seen countless times growing up, the look he wore when everything was going according to his plan. He caught my eye for just a moment and gave me a small, dismissive wave, the kind you'd give to a hotel clerk or a taxi driver, someone whose job it was to provide a service, nothing more. I wanted to scream. I wanted to activate the emergency protocol and announce to the entire room that they were being manipulated. But I was trapped by the very system I'd spent my career serving. Protocol demanded I follow the chain of command, and the chain of command had just told me to stay silent while international relations were being poisoned in real time. The session continued for another 2 hours. I sat in that booth, documenting every mistranslation, every subtle corruption of meaning, every calculated word choice designed to breed mistrust. The pattern was becoming clearer with each passing minute. This wasn't random sabotage. It was surgical precision. Whoever was orchestrating this not only understood languages, but psychology, cultural triggers, historical sensitivities. When Minister Chen Wei of the Allied Economic Consortium began speaking in Mandarin about Zhang Chen Fan Rong, shared prosperity, the translation that came through the official channels spoke of economic dominance and resource extraction. When Ambassador Hartwell discussed collaborative frameworks in English, the Russian interpretation suggested subordination agreements and compliance mechanisms. Each mistranslation was designed to hit specific cultural and political nerve points. The Chinese delegation heard suggestions of Western imperialism. The Krasnerian representatives heard implications of economic colonization. The European consortium members heard whispers of authoritarian expansion. Everyone was hearing exactly what would make them most suspicious, most offensive, most likely to walk away from the negotiating table. By lunch break, the atmosphere in the conference hall was toxic. Delegates huddled in separate groups, whispering in their native languages, casting suspicious glances across the room. What should have been friendly networking had devolved into defensive positioning. I cornered Dr. Brenner in the corridor outside the main hall. Heinrich, what's happening in there? Those aren't translation errors, they're deliberate distortions. He looked tired, older than his 63 years. For a moment, I saw something in his eyes that looked almost like regret. But then his expression hardened. Elena, you're an excellent translator, but you're not here to make policy decisions. Your job is to follow protocol and trust that people above your pay grade understand the bigger picture. The bigger picture? I kept my voice low, aware that we were surrounded by international delegates and security personnel. Heinrich, if these negotiations fail, it could destabilize global markets. The economic ripple effects alone could benefit some people enormously. He cut me off, his voice cold. Not everyone profits from stability, Elena. Some people have positioned themselves very carefully to benefit from uncertainty. The way he said it made my skin crawl. This wasn't just about translation errors or even deliberate sabotage. This was about people I knew, people I trusted, who had calculated that international chaos was worth more than international cooperation. How long have you been part of this? I asked quietly. Dr. Brenner studied my face for a long moment. Long enough to know that idealistic translators who think words can save the world are usually the first casualties when reality sets in. Elena, you're excellent at languages, but you've never understood the language that matters most. Money. He started to walk away, then paused. Your brother sends his regards, by the way. He wanted me to tell you that he appreciates your contributions to his research over the years. All those conversations about linguistic vulnerabilities, cultural trigger points, psychological impact of translation choices. Very educational. The hallway seemed to tilt around me. David hadn't just been dismissive of my work, he'd been mining it. Every family dinner where I'd shared interesting cases, every holiday conversation about cultural misunderstandings I'd helped resolve, every proud moment when I'd explained how precise translation could prevent conflicts, he'd been taking notes. My brother hadn't just betrayed our family trust, he'd weaponized 15 years of my expertise to orchestrate the very kind of international incident I'd spent my career trying to prevent. As Dr. Brenner disappeared into the crowd of delegates, I stood alone in that corridor, surrounded by the quiet hum of a dozen languages being spoken by people who had no idea they were all being systematically lied to. And I realized that in less than 6 hours, when the afternoon sessions resumed, the next phase of the sabotage would begin, unless I found a way to stop it. Not as Elena Voss, the obedient translator who followed protocol, but as Elena Voss, the woman who spoke 12 languages and understood that sometimes the most important words you can speak are the ones that expose the truth, no matter the cost. The afternoon session was a masterclass in systematic manipulation. I sat in my booth watching the conspiracy unfold with the horrifying precision of a Swiss watch. Every mistranslation was timed perfectly, every cultural miscue calculated for maximum impact. When Ambassador Yuki Tanaka from the Pacific Trade Alliance began discussing mutually beneficial resource sharing, the official translation rendered it as systematic exploitation of natural assets. When Minister Volkov responded with what should have been reassurances about ravnopravnaya partnerstva, equal partnership, the delegates heard conditional subordination agreements. I watched the faces below me transform from confusion to suspicion to barely contained anger. These were seasoned diplomats, people who had spent decades building international relations, and they were being played like children. The worst part was how reasonable it all seemed on the surface. Translation errors happen, especially in high-pressure multilingual environments. Everyone understood that. What they didn't understand was that these weren't errors at all. Dr. Brenner stood at his position, occasionally making notes, never once looking in my direction. The official translators, 3 people I'd worked with for years, continued their sabotage with professional calm. I recognized the technique. They were using what we called cultural amplification, where accurate words were chosen specifically for their emotional resonance within each culture's historical context.
For instance, when discussing trade routes through the Bering Strait, the word control was consistently used in English translations, while the Russian version emphasized oversight. To American ears, control suggested dominance and exclusion. To Russian ears, oversight implied responsible management. Both translations were technically accurate, but they created completely different emotional responses. It was brilliant and terrifying. Whoever designed this system understood that the most effective lies are built on foundations of truth. They weren't making things up. They were selecting truths that would create maximum discord. David sat 3 rows back, occasionally checking his phone with the satisfied expression of someone monitoring profitable stock trades. I noticed other faces in the audience that seemed similarly calm, almost expectant. These people weren't concerned about the growing tension. They were anticipating it. Around 3 p.m., things began to escalate beyond mere suspicion. Ambassador Hartwell requested a private consultation with her linguistic advisors. Minister Volkov did the same. Within minutes, both delegations had called for separate closed-door sessions with their respective teams. I knew what was happening. They were comparing notes, trying to understand why the other side seemed increasingly hostile, despite what appeared to be straightforward negotiations. They would review transcripts, analyze word choices, look for patterns of aggression or hidden meanings, and they would find them because they had been deliberately planted. During the 20-minute recess, I made a decision that would either save my career or destroy it. I slipped out of the interpreter's booth and followed Ambassador Hartwell's team to their private conference room. The hallway was buzzing with nervous energy, as delegates and advisors huddled in small groups, speaking in urgent whispers.
I found Ambassador Hartwell outside Conference Room B, her face lined with frustration. She was someone I'd worked with before, a veteran negotiator known for her pragmatic approach to international relations. If anyone would listen to reason, it would be her. Ambassador Hartwell, I approached carefully, aware that approaching her directly violated several protocols. I need to speak with you about the translation issues we've been experiencing. She looked up, recognition flickering across her face. Miss Voss, isn't it? You're one of the interpreters? Chief Linguistic Analyst, I corrected gently. And yes, I've been monitoring the translations today. There are some significant irregularities I think you should be aware of. Her expression sharpened. What kind of irregularities? The kind that could explain why Minister Volkov's friendly overtures are coming across as territorial threats, and why your collaborative proposals are being interpreted as demands for subordination. Ambassador Hartwell studied my face carefully. Are you telling me there have been translation errors? I'm telling you that what you're hearing and what they're saying are 2 very different things, and vice versa. She glanced around the hallway, then gestured toward an empty conference room. Show me. For the next 15 minutes, I walked her through the pattern of mistranslations, explaining how seemingly minor word choices were creating major misunderstandings. I showed her my notes, pointed out the systematic nature of the errors, demonstrated how each mistranslation was designed to trigger specific cultural anxieties. Ambassador Hartwell listened with the focused attention of someone accustomed to processing complex information quickly. When I finished, she was quiet for a long moment. Miss Voss, what you're describing sounds like deliberate sabotage. Yes, ma'am. That's exactly what it is. Why are you telling me this? Why not go through official channels? I hesitated. This was the moment where I had to decide how much truth I was willing to reveal. Because the official channels are compromised. My supervisor has ordered me not to interrupt the primary translation feed, despite obvious errors that are poisoning these negotiations. Her eyes narrowed. Ordered you to stay silent about translation errors? Specifically, yes. Ambassador Hartwell stood up and began pacing the small room. Miss Voss, if what you're describing is true, then we're not just dealing with incompetence or technical difficulties. Someone is actively working to ensure these negotiations fail. Yes, ma'am, and they're very good at what they're doing. Who would benefit from failure? That was the question I'd been dreading because answering it honestly would implicate people I knew personally. Anyone positioned to profit from international economic instability. Currency traders, defense contractors, certain investment firms that specialize in volatility markets. Do you have specific information about who's behind this? I thought about David's satisfied expression, Dr. Brenner's cold dismissal, the way certain audience members seem to be anticipating conflict rather than dreading it. I have suspicions, but I need more time to gather evidence before I can make specific accusations. Ambassador Hartwell stopped pacing and looked directly at me. Miss Voss, I'm going to ask you a direct question, and I need a direct answer. Can you provide accurate translations for the remainder of these negotiations? Not through official channels. My supervisor has made it clear that I'm to follow the existing protocol regardless of accuracy. What about unofficial channels? The question hung in the air between us. She was asking me to commit what would essentially be insubordination, possibly treason, depending on how the authorities chose to interpret my actions. But she was also asking me to do the job I'd sworn to do when I took my oath as a diplomatic interpreter, to facilitate understanding between nations, not to enable their manipulation. Ambassador, if I were to provide alternative translations through back channels, it would end my career, possibly result in criminal charges. And if you don't? I thought about the faces I'd seen in the main conference hall, the growing suspicion and anger, the way decades of careful diplomatic relationship building was being systematically destroyed by people who saw international chaos as a profit opportunity. If I don't, these negotiations will fail spectacularly. The economic consequences will be felt globally within weeks, and we'll likely see the kind of international tensions that, historically, precede much larger conflicts. Ambassador Hartwell nodded slowly. Miss Voss, I can't officially ask you to violate protocol, but I can tell you that if accurate information were to become available through any means necessary to prevent an international incident, my government would view that information as invaluable. She paused at the door. The afternoon session resumes in 10 minutes. Whatever you decide to do, decide quickly, because if this continues much longer, it won't matter how accurate your translations are. The damage will be irreversible. As she left, I remained in that small conference room, staring at my reflection in the polished table surface. Everything I'd worked for, everything I'd built, was about to be sacrificed. But the alternative was watching the world slide toward conflict because I chose my career over my conscience. I had 10 minutes to decide whether Elena Voss, the diplomatic translator, would continue following orders, or whether Elena Voss, the woman who spoke 12 languages and understood their power, would finally use that power the way it was meant to be used. The choice, I realized, had already been made the moment I walked into Ambassador Hartwell's conference room. Now I just had to find the courage to follow through with it. I walked back to the interpreter's booth with deliberate calm, my mind racing while my body moved with the measured pace of someone simply returning from a break. The decision was made, but the execution would require everything I'd learned in 15 years of high-stakes diplomatic work. This wasn't just about translation anymore, it was about psychological warfare, and I was about to engage the enemy on their own terms.
The afternoon session resumed at 3:30 p.m. with renewed tension. The delegates had clearly used their break to consult with advisors and review transcripts. I could see it in their posture, the way they leaned forward slightly, the increased alertness that indicated they were now actively listening for hidden meanings and subtle threats. The saboteurs had succeeded in creating exactly the atmosphere they wanted. Hypervigilance bordering on paranoia. Minister Volkov opened with what I knew to be a genuine attempt at reconciliation, speaking in careful Russian about «stроительство мостов доверия», building bridges of trust. But as the official translation rendered it as establishing surveillance networks, I watched Ambassador Hartwell's jaw tighten almost imperceptibly. This was my moment. I activated my personal recording device, a small digital unit I'd brought for taking notes, completely within protocol. But instead of notes, I began creating what would become my evidence trail. Every mistranslation, every cultural manipulation, every deliberate distortion. I documented them all in real time, building the case that would either vindicate me or destroy me. Then I did something that violated every rule of diplomatic interpretation. I opened a secure text channel on my personal device. The diplomatic corps used an encrypted messaging system for emergency communications between staff members. Technically, I had access to it as CLA. Officially, it was meant for coordinating logistics and handling technical issues. What I was about to do fell far outside its intended purpose. I began sending real-time, accurate translations directly to Ambassador Hartwell's secure device. The first message was simple. Volkov just said, building bridges of trust, not establishing surveillance networks. This is Elena Voss, CLA, confirming deliberate mistranslation. I watched as Ambassador Hartwell glanced at her device, read the message, and looked up toward my booth. She couldn't see me clearly through the tinted glass, but I could see the slight nod that acknowledged receipt. For the next 40 minutes, I ran a parallel translation service. While the official interpreters continued their sabotage, I provided the real meanings through encrypted back channels. When Minister Chen Wei spoke about 合作共赢, cooperative mutual benefit, and the official translation suggested asymmetric advantage extraction, I immediately sent the correction. But it wasn't enough just to provide accurate translations. I needed to establish patterns to show that this wasn't random incompetence, but systematic manipulation. So I began sending analytical notes alongside the corrections. Pattern analysis. Official translation consistently uses emotionally charged terms when discussing economic cooperation. Chinese partnership becomes dominance. Russian collaboration becomes control. English mutual benefit becomes resource extraction. This is psychological manipulation designed to trigger historical fears. Ambassador Hartwell began responding with brief confirmations. Understood. Continue monitoring. Then, after about an hour, can you identify who's controlling this? That was the question I'd been dreading, because answering it meant pointing fingers at people I'd worked with for years, including family. But I'd come too far to stop now. Dr. Heinrich Brenner, my direct supervisor, is actively preventing me from correcting errors. He has knowledge of linguistics sufficient to recognize these distortions. Other team members include translators Yuki Nakamura, Pierre Dubois, and Maria Santos, all experienced professionals who would normally catch these errors immediately. Then I added the information that hurt the most to type. Personal connection. My brother, David Voss, CEO of Meridian Global Investments, present in audience. Firm specializes in volatility markets and currency speculation. Prior conversations suggest he has detailed knowledge of linguistic vulnerabilities in international negotiations. The weight of that message settled in my chest like a stone. I had just accused my own brother of international financial conspiracy. There would be no going back from this moment. No family dinner where we could pretend this conversation never happened. But even as I sent that message, I noticed something that made my blood run cold. The pattern of mistranslations was accelerating. What had started as subtle manipulation was now becoming more aggressive, more obvious. Instead of carefully chosen words that could be dismissed as interpretation differences, the official translators were now making errors so blatant that even non-speakers were beginning to notice. Minister Volkov's aide leaned over and whispered something in his ear. The minister's eyebrows rose slightly. He was becoming aware that something was wrong with the translations.
On the other side of the room, Ambassador Hartwell's team was passing notes with increasing urgency. I realized what was happening. The conspiracy was entering its endgame. They had succeeded in poisoning the atmosphere, creating suspicion and mistrust. Now they were pushing for complete breakdown, making the mistranslations so obvious that delegates would inevitably accuse each other of deliberate deception. It was brilliant in its cynicism. Once the delegates realized they had been receiving false information, they wouldn't just be angry about trade negotiations, they would be furious about being lied to at the most fundamental level. International incidents had been started over far less. I sent an urgent message to Ambassador Hartwell. Translation errors becoming intentionally obvious, conspiracy moving to final phase. Once delegates realize the extent of manipulation, accusations of deliberate deception will destroy all trust. Estimate 20 to 30 minutes before complete breakdown. Her response was immediate. What do you need? What did I need? I needed authority I didn't have, access I wasn't permitted, and the ability to expose a conspiracy that involved my own family without destroying my life in the process. But what I said was simpler. I need to address the full assembly. Official mistranslations must be corrected publicly before delegates begin accusing each other of deception. That would require overriding your supervisor's authority and violating interpretation protocols. Yes, ma'am. It would also require someone with diplomatic immunity to authorize the interruption, since my credentials alone won't be sufficient. There was a longer pause before her next message. Stand by, preparing diplomatic authorization for emergency linguistic intervention.
I sat in that booth, watching the careful work of decades of international relationship building being systematically destroyed by people who saw global instability as a business opportunity. In 15 minutes, Ambassador Hartwell would either give me the authority to save these negotiations, or I would have to watch the world slide toward economic chaos while knowing I could have prevented it. The irony wasn't lost on me. David had always dismissed me as just a translator, someone who repeated what other people said. But translation isn't about repetition, it's about trust. International negotiations depend on the absolute confidence that words mean what they appear to mean, that cultural nuances are respected, that the person in the booth speaks truth rather than manipulation. When you destroy that trust, you don't just ruin a conversation, you undermine the very foundation of diplomatic communication. And once that foundation cracks, the collapse can be swift and catastrophic. I looked down at David in the audience, still checking his phone with satisfaction, still confident that his little sister posed no threat to his carefully orchestrated plan. He thought he understood language because he could conduct business in multiple tongues. He had no idea that true linguistic power isn't about speaking, it's about being trusted to speak truth. In 10 minutes, he was about to learn exactly what 12 languages could accomplish in the hands of someone who refused to let greed masquerade as communication. The question was whether I would have the authority to use them, or whether I would have to watch in silence as his conspiracy succeeded in poisoning international relations for a generation. At 4:17 p.m., everything changed. Ambassador Hartwell's message arrived with the weight of diplomatic authority behind it. Emergency linguistic intervention authorized under Article 47 of the Geneva Convention on Diplomatic Protocols. You have full authorization to interrupt proceedings and address the assembly. Security has been notified. Proceed when ready. I stared at the message for 30 seconds, feeling the magnitude of what was about to happen. In my entire career, I had never seen Article 47 invoked. It was a nuclear option, reserved for situations where linguistic misunderstandings posed immediate threats to international security. By invoking it, Ambassador Hartwell was essentially declaring that we were on the brink of an international incident caused by communication breakdown. She was also putting her own career on the line to give me the authority to act.
I stood up in the interpreter's booth, my legs steadier than I had expected. Below me, the conference continued its descent into manufactured chaos. Minister Volkov was responding to what he believed was a question about cultural exchange programs, but the official translation was presenting his answer as a discussion of systematic ideological penetration. Ambassador Hartwell's counterpart from the European Trade Commission was growing visibly agitated, making notes with increasingly sharp strokes. I activated the main communication override system, a system designed to cut through all other audio channels in case of emergency. The red light on my console began flashing, indicating that I now had priority access to every speaker in the Geneva International Conference Center. Ladies and gentlemen, this is Elena Voss, Chief Linguistic Analyst for the International Diplomatic Corps. I am exercising emergency authority under Article 47 of the Geneva Convention on Diplomatic Protocols to address critical communication errors that are threatening the integrity of these negotiations. The effect was immediate and dramatic. Every conversation in the main hall stopped. Heads turned toward the interpreter's booth. I could see Dr. Brenner across the room, his face flushed with what looked like panic and rage. Several security personnel moved to positions near the exits, standard protocol when Article 47 was invoked. David, sitting in the third row, had gone completely still. For the first time since I'd known him, my brother looked genuinely surprised. For the past 4 hours, I continued, my voice carrying clearly through the hall's audio system, you have been receiving systematically corrupted translations designed to create mistrust and ensure the failure of these negotiations. What you have been hearing is not what your counterparts have been saying. A murmur rippled through the assembly. I could see delegates checking their notes, whispering to advisors, trying to process what I was telling them. Minister Volkov, when you spoke about building bridges of trust, the official translation told the consortium delegates you were discussing establishing surveillance networks. Ambassador Chen, when you offered cooperative mutual benefit, the Russian delegation heard asymmetric advantage extraction. Commissioner Hartwell, when you proposed collaborative frameworks, the Chinese representatives were told you were demanding subordination agreements. The murmur was growing louder now, becoming a buzz of shocked conversation. I could see recognition dawning on faces throughout the hall. The pieces were falling into place. All those moments of unexpected hostility, all those responses that seemed disproportionate to what they thought they had said. These are not accidental errors. They are carefully calculated distortions designed to trigger specific cultural and historical anxieties within each delegation. Someone has been systematically poisoning your communications to ensure these negotiations fail. That's when Dr. Brenner made his move. He stood up from his position and activated his own override system. Ladies and gentlemen, I apologize for this interruption. Ms. Voss is experiencing a stress-related breakdown and has exceeded her authority. Security, please escort her from the building immediately.
For a moment, silence hung in the hall like a held breath. This was the critical moment. Would the assembly believe the established authority figure or the subordinate making explosive accusations? Ambassador Hartwell stood up. Dr. Brenner, Ms. Voss is operating under my direct authorization and that of the Diplomatic Security Council. She will continue her presentation. The power struggle was now visible to everyone in the room. Dr. Brenner's face had gone red. Ambassador, this woman is making unsubstantiated accusations. Doctor, Minister Volkov interrupted, his English careful but clear. I would very much like to hear what Ms. Voss has to say. In the past hour, I have been growing concerned about the reactions I have been receiving to what I believed were friendly overtures. Ambassador Chen nodded. I share Minister Volkov's concern. The responses to our proposals have seemed unexpectedly hostile.
I realized this was my moment, not just to expose the conspiracy, but to demonstrate the power of accurate communication. Minister Volkov, would you please repeat in Russian the statement you made at 3:47 this afternoon about regional cooperation? He nodded and spoke clearly. Мы стремимся к построению долгосрочного партнерства, основанного на взаимном уважении и равных возможностях для всех участников. The official translation you heard, I said, looking directly at the consortium delegates, was, we intend to establish long-term control mechanisms based on systematic advantages and preferential access for select participants. What Minister Volkov actually said was, we strive to build long-term partnership based on mutual respect and equal opportunities for all parties. The reaction was instant and intense. Ambassador Hartwell's aide was furiously checking transcripts on her tablet. Commissioner Elena Fitzgerald from the European delegation was shaking her head in disbelief. The Chinese economic attaché was speaking rapidly into his phone. Ambassador Chen, at 4:02, you spoke about cooperative frameworks. Would you please repeat that statement in Mandarin? 当然可以，我们希望建立互利共赢的合作关系，促进各方共同发展和繁荣。The Russian delegation heard, we hope to establish dominance relationships for resource extraction, promoting single-party development and wealth concentration. What Ambassador Chen actually said was, we hope to establish mutually beneficial cooperative relationships, promoting shared development and prosperity for all parties. The hall erupted, not in anger, but in a kind of shocked understanding. These were experienced diplomats who had spent decades learning to read between the lines, to detect subtle implications and hidden meanings. They were now realizing that they had been reading implications that were never there, detecting hostility that had been artificially inserted into their communications. Minister Volkov walked over to Ambassador Hartwell. In careful English, he said, Ambassador, I believe we have all been victims of a very sophisticated deception. She nodded. Minister, I think you're absolutely right. The question now is who orchestrated this deception and why? That's when I did the hardest thing I'd ever done in my professional life. I looked directly at David, sitting in his third-row seat, with his phone clutched in his hand, and I spoke the words that would destroy our family forever. The conspiracy involves multiple parties positioned to profit from international economic instability. This includes compromised linguistic staff, corrupted translation systems, and financial entities that have taken positions betting against the success of these negotiations. David was staring at me now, his expression a mixture of disbelief and rage. I could see him calculating, trying to figure out how much I knew, how much I could prove. Among the entities that would benefit from the failure of these talks are several investment firms specializing in currency volatility and economic uncertainty, firms that have been positioning themselves for months to profit from exactly the kind of international crisis that would result from the collapse of these negotiations. I paused, looking directly at my brother. Firms like Meridian Global Investments. The silence that followed was absolute. Every eye in the room turned toward David, who had gone completely pale. The phone slipped from his hand and clattered to the floor. And in that moment, I understood that there was no going back. I had just lit a fuse that would either expose the truth or destroy everything I'd ever cared about, possibly both. The aftermath was swift and merciless. Within minutes of my accusation, the conference hall transformed from a diplomatic venue to something resembling a crime scene. Security personnel moved with practiced efficiency, sealing exits and establishing communication protocols. Ambassador Hartwell was speaking rapidly into her secure phone, while Minister Volkov conferred with his aide in urgent Russian. The careful decorum of international diplomacy had given way to the stark reality of exposed conspiracy. David remained frozen in his seat, staring at me with an expression I'd never seen before. Not anger, not betrayal, but something closer to genuine fear. The confidence that had always defined him, the smug certainty that he understood how the world worked, had evaporated completely. For the first time in our lives, I was the one with power, and he was the one exposed and vulnerable. Dr. Brenner was attempting damage control, speaking rapidly to someone on his phone while shooting desperate glances in my direction. But his authority had crumbled the moment Ambassador Hartwell confirmed my authorization. In the world of international diplomacy, when multiple sovereign nations unite behind a single narrative, individual protestations become irrelevant. Ladies and gentlemen, Ambassador Hartwell's voice cut through the buzz of conversation, we are implementing immediate lockdown protocols while we investigate these allegations. No one will be permitted to leave the building until we have secured all evidence and conducted preliminary interviews.
The announcement sent a ripple of shock through the assembly. These were people accustomed to diplomatic immunity, to courtesy and protocol. The idea that they were essentially being detained was unprecedented. But the gravity of the situation was becoming clear to everyone. If Elena Voss was correct, they had all been manipulated into nearly triggering an international incident. I remained in the interpreter's booth, suddenly aware that I was now the most important person in the room and potentially the most vulnerable. I had just accused powerful people of international conspiracy. If I was wrong, my career was over. If I was right, my life might be in danger. My secure phone buzzed with a message from Ambassador Hartwell. Stay in the booth. Security is positioning around you. Do you have additional evidence to support the accusations? I typed back quickly. Yes, recorded conversations, financial analysis, timeline documentation. Everything is on my personal devices and in secure cloud storage. Her response was immediate. We are sending technical specialists to retrieve and verify your evidence. Do not communicate with anyone until they arrive. As I waited, I watched David below me. He had recovered enough from his initial shock to begin making phone calls, but I could see security personnel moving closer to his position. Every call he made was being monitored, every message logged. The invisible net of international law enforcement was tightening around him, and he was beginning to realize it. Dr. Brenner approached David's seat, a move that confirmed my suspicions about their collaboration. I watched them speak in low, urgent tones, their body language betraying panic and desperation. These were people who had planned for many contingencies, but not for the possibility that a mere translator would blow up their entire operation in front of a room full of international witnesses. Minister Volkov approached the interpreter's booth, speaking to the security guard positioned outside. After a brief conversation, the guard gestured for me to activate my audio system. Ms. Voss, Minister Volkov's voice was grave but respectful, on behalf of the Krasnarian Federation, I want to express our gratitude for your courage in exposing this deception. However, I must ask, how long has this been going on? How many other negotiations have been compromised? The question hit me like cold water. In focusing on this specific conference, I hadn't fully considered the broader implications. If this conspiracy was sophisticated enough to corrupt multiple translators and translation systems, how many other international negotiations had been sabotaged? How many trade deals, peace accords, and diplomatic agreements had failed not because of legitimate disagreements, but because of deliberately introduced miscommunications? Minister, I replied carefully, based on the sophistication of this operation, I believe this is not an isolated incident. The techniques being used here would have taken months to develop and test. This suggests a pattern of interference in international communications. Ambassador Chen Wei joined the conversation. Ms. Voss, you mentioned financial entities profiting from instability. Can you be more specific about how such profits would be generated? I glanced toward David, who was now standing and gesticulating wildly while speaking into his phone. Currency speculation is the most obvious mechanism. If you know in advance that negotiations will fail, you can position yourself to profit from the resulting market volatility. Short positions on stable currencies, long positions on commodities that spike during international tensions, investments in defense contractors that benefit from increased global uncertainty. And your brother's firm specializes in such investments? Minister Volkov asked. This was the moment I had been dreading, the point where professional duty required me to destroy my family completely. Meridian Global Investments markets itself as a volatility specialist. They profit from market uncertainty and have consistently taken positions that benefit from international instability. 3 months ago, David asked me detailed questions about linguistic vulnerabilities in diplomatic communications. I thought he was just curious about my work. The silence that followed was heavy with implication. These were experienced negotiators who understood exactly what I was describing: the systematic exploitation of international communications for financial gain. Ambassador Hartwell's voice came through the speakers. Ms. Voss, we're ready to examine your evidence. Please remain in position while our technical team accesses your documentation. 2 specialists in dark suits entered the booth, followed by a third person I recognize as Deputy Director Sarah Kellerman from the International Security Agency. Her presence meant this was no longer just a diplomatic incident. It was now a matter of international security. Ms. Voss, Director Kellerman's voice was crisp and professional, we understand you have documented evidence of systematic translation manipulation and potential conspiracy to destabilize international negotiations. Is that correct? Yes, ma'am. I have audio recordings of the corrupted translations, timeline analysis showing the pattern of errors, communication logs demonstrating coordination between compromised staff members, and financial research indicating which entities would profit from the failure of these negotiations. And this evidence implicates your brother? The question hung in the air. This was my last chance to protect David, to claim that I had been mistaken about his involvement, to preserve what was left of our family relationship. But looking down at him in the conference hall, watching him make increasingly desperate phone calls while security personnel closed in, I knew that protecting him would mean betraying everyone else in this room and potentially enabling future attacks on international diplomacy. Yes, ma'am. The evidence strongly suggests that my brother and his firm have been positioned to profit from the failure of these negotiations, and that he has been using information I provided about linguistic vulnerabilities to help design this attack. Director Kellerman nodded grimly. Ms. Voss, you understand that by making these accusations, you are potentially exposing yourself to retaliation from powerful interests.
I thought about David's expression when I first accused his firm, the way his surprise had quickly turned to calculation. I thought about Dr. Brenner's immediate attempt to discredit me, the anonymous phone calls I'd been receiving, the subtle pressures that had been building around me for weeks. Ma'am, I believe that retaliation has already begun. I think this conspiracy runs deeper than just this conference, and I think the people involved have been preparing for the possibility of exposure. Director Kellerman's expression sharpened. What kind of preparation? The kind that would make whistleblowers disappear, evidence vanish, and accusations look like the paranoid delusions of someone who had a nervous breakdown under pressure. As if to confirm my words, David suddenly looked up toward the interpreter's booth. For a moment, our eyes met across the distance of the conference hall. The brother I had grown up with, who had taught me to ride a bicycle and helped me with math homework, was gone. In his place was someone I didn't recognize, someone who looked at me not with love or even anger, but with the cold calculation of someone measuring threat levels and response options. That look told me everything I needed to know about what came next. This wasn't just about exposing a conspiracy anymore. This was about survival. As Director Kellerman and her team began examining my evidence, I found myself thinking back to where this all began. Not the conference, not the mistranslations, but the moment when I first started noticing that something was fundamentally wrong with the world I had dedicated my life to serving. It was 3 months ago, during what I thought was just another family dinner at David's penthouse apartment in Manhattan. The view from his dining room stretched across the city skyline, a testament to the success he'd built in international finance. Eva, his wife, had prepared her usual elaborate spread, and we were discussing our respective work over wine that probably cost more than most people's monthly salary. "Elena," David had said, leaning back in his chair with that characteristic confidence, "I've been thinking about your work lately. All of these international negotiations you handle, they must be incredibly sensitive to, what would you call it, linguistic nuance?" I remember being pleased that he was finally showing interest in what I did. For years, our conversations had been politely superficial, with David clearly considering my work as some sort of academic curiosity rather than real profession. "Absolutely," I had replied, probably more enthusiastically than warranted. A single word choice can completely change the meaning of a proposal. Cultural context is everything. What sounds like partnership to one delegation might sound like subordination to another. David nodded thoughtfully, swirling his wine. "Give me an example." So I did. I explained how the Chinese concept of guanxi, relationship-based influence, had no direct English equivalent, and how mistranslating it as corruption versus networking could destroy trade negotiations. I told him about the time a peace treaty almost collapsed because the Arabic term for temporary ceasefire was translated as strategic pause, implying preparation for renewed warfare. "Fascinating," David had murmured. "So, someone with detailed knowledge of these linguistic pressure points could theoretically, what, sabotage negotiations?" "Theoretically, yes," I had laughed, "but it would require incredible sophistication. You'd need to understand not just languages, but cultural psychology, historical context, political sensitivities, and you'd need access to the translation systems themselves." Eva had joined the conversation then, her voice carrying that sweet tone that always made me slightly uncomfortable. "David's been working on some currency hedging strategies based on international political stability. It's fascinating how much money moves based on whether people think countries will get along." I should have paid more attention to that comment, should have asked follow-up questions, should have wondered why my brother was suddenly so interested in the technical details of diplomatic interpretation. But I was just happy that my family was finally taking an interest in my work. Over the following weeks, David called me several more times with questions, always framed as curiosity, always seeming genuine. He wanted to know about backup translation protocols, about how errors were typically caught and corrected, about the psychological impact of subtle mistranslations on negotiating teams. "I'm thinking about writing an article for the Financial Times about how miscommunication drives market volatility. Your expertise would be invaluable." I gave him everything. Technical details about interpretation systems, case studies of failed negotiations, and analysis of how different cultures responded to various forms of linguistic manipulation. I even sent him academic papers I'd written about the weaponization of translation in international conflicts. At the time, I thought I was helping my brother understand my profession. Now, sitting in that interpreter's booth while Director Kellerman's team analyzed the evidence of systematic sabotage, I realized I had been providing him with a blueprint for exactly the kind of attack we had just experienced. The memory that hurt the most was from 6 weeks ago. David had taken me to lunch at his private club, one of those exclusive Manhattan establishments where deals worth billions were discussed over perfectly prepared meals. We were seated by the window, looking out at the bustling financial district. "Elena," he had said over dessert, "hypothetically speaking, if someone wanted to ensure that international negotiations failed, what would be the most effective approach?" "That's a strange hypothetical," I had replied, suddenly uneasy. "Just curious. For the article, what would be the most subtle way to sabotage diplomatic communications?" I should have stopped the conversation there, should have asked why he needed such specific information about sabotage techniques. Instead, I treated it as an intellectual exercise. Well, I had said, the most effective approach would be to introduce errors that seem plausible but trigger specific cultural anxieties. You wouldn't want obvious mistranslations. Those would be caught immediately. You'd want subtle distortions that feel authentic but create emotional responses designed to breed mistrust.
David had leaned forward, genuinely interested. "Can you be more specific?" And I was. I explained the concept of linguistic amplification, using technically accurate words that carried maximum emotional weight within specific cultural contexts. I described how historical grievances could be triggered through careful word choices. I even outlined how modern translation systems could be compromised to introduce systematic errors while maintaining plausible deniability. The key, I had explained, would be to make each side believe the other was being deliberately provocative when actually both sides were being manipulated by false information. David had nodded thoughtfully, making notes on his phone. And the people doing this manipulation, they would need to understand the target cultures intimately? Absolutely. And they'd need access to the interpretation systems, plus backup translators who were either compromised or incompetent. It would require significant resources and careful planning. By the end of that lunch, I had essentially provided David with a complete operational manual for the conspiracy I would later expose. The irony was devastating. The expertise I had spent 15 years developing to facilitate international understanding had been turned into a weapon against the very process I was trying to protect. Now, watching Director Kellerman review the evidence, I understood that David hadn't just stumbled into this conspiracy. He had built it, using my knowledge as the foundation. Every technical detail I had shared, every cultural vulnerability I had explained, every systemic weakness I had identified, all of it had been weaponized against the international community. The worst part was realizing how long the planning had taken. This wasn't a spontaneous scheme born from greed. This was a carefully orchestrated, months-long operation designed to exploit the very trust that made international diplomacy possible. And I had been an unwitting collaborator from the beginning. Director Kellerman looked up from her review of my documentation. "Ms. Voss, these recordings and timeline analyses are extensive. How long have you been collecting this evidence?" "I started 3 weeks ago when I first noticed the pattern of mistranslations, but the full scope of what I was seeing didn't become clear until this morning." "And your suspicions about your brother's involvement?" I thought about those family dinners, those seemingly innocent questions. The way David's interest in my work had felt so gratifying at the time and so sinister in retrospect. I began to suspect yesterday when I realized that the sabotage techniques being used matched almost exactly the vulnerabilities I had described to him in private conversations. But I didn't want to believe it until I saw the financial evidence showing his firm's positioning to profit from the failure of these negotiations. Director Kellerman nodded grimly. "Ms. Voss, what you've uncovered appears to be not just financial conspiracy, but systematic information warfare against international diplomatic processes. The techniques you've documented could be replicated and used to destabilize negotiations around the world." Looking back at David in the conference hall, I realized that was probably exactly the plan. This wasn't just about profiting from one failed negotiation. This was about developing and testing a replicable system for turning international cooperation into international conflict, with massive financial gains for anyone positioned to benefit from global instability. I had thought I was teaching my brother about the beauty and complexity of international communication. Instead, I had been providing him with the tools to destroy it. Director Kellerman's technical team worked with the methodical precision of people accustomed to extracting truth from digital chaos. I watched them connect my personal devices to sophisticated analysis equipment, their screens filling with data streams, communication logs, and financial records that painted an increasingly disturbing picture of the conspiracy I had helped create. Director Kellerman said, reviewing the preliminary analysis, Ms. Voss, your documentation shows systematic compromise of interpretation protocols dating back at least 4 months. But what we're finding in the metadata suggests this operation has roots going back much further. She turned her tablet toward me, showing a timeline that made my stomach clench. These financial positioning records from Meridian Global show currency short positions and volatility investments that predate your conversations with your brother by nearly 8 months. Which means the planning for this operation began long before he started extracting information from you. The implication hit me like a physical blow. David hadn't decided to become a criminal after I gave him the technical knowledge. He had already been planning international financial manipulation and had targeted me specifically as a source of expertise. You're saying he approached me as a mark, not as a sister? I'm saying that your brother appears to have identified you as a valuable intelligence asset and cultivated you accordingly. The timeline suggests a sophisticated long-term operation designed to weaponize your knowledge while maintaining your trust and cooperation. One of the technical specialists looked up from his analysis. Director, we're seeing coordinated activity across multiple translation services and diplomatic communication platforms. This wasn't just about corrupting the interpreters at this conference. They've been systematically compromising international communication infrastructure. Director Kellerman's expression darkened. Show me. For the next 30 minutes, I watched them unravel a conspiracy that dwarfed anything I had imagined. The attack on our conference wasn't an isolated incident. It was a field test of a system designed to destabilize international relations on a global scale. They showed me evidence of compromised translation software deployed to embassies in 12 countries, backup interpretation services that had been infiltrated by operatives trained in the techniques I had unknowingly helped design, communication networks that had been seeded with algorithms designed to introduce subtle linguistic distortions during high-stakes negotiations. This is systematic information warfare, Director Kellerman said grimly. Your brother and his associates haven't just been manipulating currency markets, they've been building the infrastructure to control international diplomatic communications.
The scope was breathtaking and terrifying. Trade negotiations between Asian Pacific nations had failed 6 weeks ago due to translation difficulties. A peace accord in Eastern Europe had collapsed last month when delegates accused each other of making demands that, according to the evidence on my screen, had never actually been stated. 3 major international climate agreements had been delayed indefinitely due to insurmountable cultural misunderstandings that now appeared to have been artificially created. How many people are involved? I asked, though I wasn't sure I wanted to know the answer. We're identifying at least 47 compromised individuals across 17 countries, the technical specialist replied. Translators, cultural consultants, communication technicians, software developers. And that's just what we can confirm from your documentation and the forensic analysis of the systems used today. Dr. Brenner's involvement was becoming clearer as well. He wasn't just a supervisor who had been bribed to look the other way. He was a key coordinator, responsible for recruiting and managing compromised interpretation staff across multiple international organizations. Dr. Brenner has been in his position for 15 years, Director Kellerman explained, showing me his communication records. He's had access to recruit translators, influence hiring decisions, and establish protocols that would facilitate this kind of manipulation. He's been building this network for years. I thought about all the interpreters I had worked with, all the colleagues I had trusted. How many of them had been recruited? How many conferences had been sabotaged? How many international relations had been destroyed by people I considered friends and mentors? The evidence showed that the conspiracy operated like a sophisticated intelligence service, with cells of operatives who knew only their specific roles. Most of the translators probably didn't understand the full scope of what they were participating in.
They had been told they were part of market research or cultural analysis projects that required them to introduce specific linguistic variations into their work. Only the core group, David, Dr. Brenner, and perhaps a dozen others, understood that they were systematically destroying international cooperation for financial gain. The financial analysis is particularly revealing, Director Kellerman continued, showing me trading records that made my head spin. Meridian Global and its associated entities have generated approximately $2.3 billion in profits over the past year from currency speculation, commodity manipulation, and defense contractor investments, all positioned to benefit from international instability. But that's not the most concerning part, the technical specialist added. We're seeing evidence that they've been selling this capability to other actors, state sponsors, criminal organizations, terrorist groups, anyone willing to pay for the ability to destabilize international relations through corrupted communications. The room felt like it was spinning. I had spent my career believing that language was a tool for building bridges between cultures, for creating understanding where none had existed before. Now I was learning that my expertise had been used to turn language into a weapon, capable of triggering international conflicts. Miss Voss, Director Kellerman said gently, I need you to understand something. The knowledge you shared with your brother didn't create this conspiracy. It accelerated it. These people were already committed to destabilizing international relations. Your expertise simply made them more effective. The distinction didn't make me feel much better. How long before they would have succeeded if I hadn't exposed them today? Based on the operational timeline we're reconstructing, they were preparing to expand operations significantly. This conference was intended as a final test before deploying their system against major diplomatic initiatives worldwide. The failure of these trade negotiations would have provided both massive financial returns and proof of concept for larger operations. She paused, letting the implications sink in. Miss Voss, if you hadn't acted when you did, we could have been looking at systematic collapse of international diplomatic communications within 6 months. Every major negotiation, every peace process, every trade agreement, all potentially compromised by people who view global chaos as a profit center. I stared out through the booth's glass at the conference hall below, where David was now in animated conversation with what appeared to be a team of lawyers who had somehow materialized despite the building lockdown. Even facing exposure and potential arrest, he was still calculating, still trying to find angles and escape routes. What happens now? I asked. Now we gather enough evidence to prosecute not just the individuals involved, but to dismantle the entire network they've built. That means identifying every compromised translator, every corrupted system, every financial entity that has profited from this operation. Director Kellerman leaned forward. Miss Voss, we're going to need your help. Your understanding of linguistic manipulation techniques, your knowledge of international interpretation protocols, your ability to identify the cultural pressure points they've been exploiting, all of that will be essential to undoing the damage they've caused. I looked down at David again, watching him gesture emphatically while his legal team took notes. My brother, who had taught me to think strategically, who had shown me how to analyze complex systems and find weaknesses to exploit. He had been an excellent teacher. Now I was going to use everything he had taught me to destroy the empire he had built on the corruption of my life's work. What do you need me to do? As the investigation deepened, the true magnitude of what we were facing became clear. This wasn't just about financial fraud or even systematic translation manipulation. We had stumbled onto something that threatened the very foundation of international cooperation itself. Director Kellerman received a secure communication that made her face go pale. She listened for several minutes, her expression growing increasingly grim, before ending the call and turning to address the expanded team that had gathered in the conference room adjacent to my booth. "We have confirmation from intelligence agencies in 7 countries," she announced. "The techniques documented here have been deployed in at least 43 separate international negotiations over the past 18 months. 3 peace processes, multiple trade agreements, climate accords, nuclear non-proliferation talks, all systematically sabotaged using variations of the methodology Ms. Voss helped identify." The weight of that revelation settled over me like lead. 43 negotiations, millions of lives affected by failed peace processes, environmental protections delayed by corrupted climate talks, economic hardships caused by destroyed trade agreements, all because people like my brother had decided that global instability was more profitable than global cooperation. "The Norwegian peace initiative that collapsed in March," Director Kellerman continued, consulting her notes. "Preliminary analysis suggests the mediating translators were providing systematically corrupted interpretations that made reconciliation impossible. Both sides believed the other was making impossible demands that were never actually stated." Minister Volkov, who had joined our security briefing, spoke quietly. "The Eastern European Energy Consortium negotiations, they failed because of accusations that we were demanding territorial concessions in exchange for energy partnerships. We never made such demands." "According to our analysis," one of the technical specialists added, "the interpretation software used in those talks was compromised with the same algorithms we found in today's systems. Your actual proposals for joint infrastructure development were translated as territorial acquisition demands." Ambassador Chenwei shook her head in disbelief. "The Pacific Trade Alliance talks last month, we were accused of insisting on military base access rights. We were actually proposing educational exchange programs. The mistranslation was so egregious, we couldn't understand why anyone would believe we had made such demands." I listened to these revelations with growing horror and a sick sense of responsibility. Each failed negotiation represented not just diplomatic breakdown, but real human suffering. Peace processes that could have ended conflicts, trade agreements that could have lifted populations out of poverty, environmental accords that could have addressed climate change more effectively. All destroyed by the weaponization of my expertise. "Miss Voss," Director Kellerman said, pulling me from my spiral of guilt, "we need your help to understand the full scope of what they've built. You know these linguistic manipulation techniques better than anyone. Can you help us identify which other negotiations might have been compromised?" For the next 2 hours, I worked with an international team of analysts, reviewing transcripts and recordings from diplomatic meetings across 6 continents. The pattern became sickeningly familiar. Subtle mistranslations designed to trigger specific cultural anxieties, word choices calculated to suggest threats where none existed, linguistic amplification techniques that turned routine diplomatic language into inflammatory accusations. The sophistication was breathtaking. They had created what amounted to a global network of linguistic warfare, capable of destabilizing any international negotiation by introducing precisely calibrated miscommunications. It was like a virus designed to attack the immune system of international diplomacy itself. "The African Union mediation talks," I said, identifying another compromised negotiation. "Look at this phrase here. The French delegate's proposal for cooperation mutual was translated to the Arabic delegation as asymmetric subordination, and the Arabic response about partnership principles was rendered in French as dominance structures. Neither side ever heard what the other actually said." "The pattern is consistent across all compromise negotiations," Director Kellerman observed. "They identify the specific historical and cultural trigger points for each delegation, then craft mistranslations designed to activate those sensitivities." What made it even more insidious was the plausible deniability. When negotiations failed and delegates accused each other of making unreasonable demands, the transcripts showed those exact demands in black and white. It looked like ordinary diplomatic failure caused by irreconcilable differences, not systematic manipulation by external actors. The financial modeling is particularly sophisticated, another analyst reported. They weren't just betting on random instability. They were creating specific types of chaos designed to move markets in predictable directions. Currency speculation timed to diplomatic failures, commodity futures positioned to benefit from regional conflicts, defense contractor investments activated by regional tensions. I thought about David's penthouse apartment, his expensive wine, his casual confidence. All of it built on a foundation of manufactured human suffering. "Director," I said quietly, "there's something else we need to consider. If they've been this successful at destabilizing international cooperation, what happens when hostile state actors realize what they've built?" The room fell silent. Director Kellerman's expression indicated she had already been thinking about exactly that scenario. "We have evidence that the methodology has already been shared with at least 3 intelligence services known for destabilization operations. The techniques your brother's network developed are being weaponized by actors whose goals go beyond financial profit." The implications were staggering. A rogue network, motivated by greed, was dangerous enough, but state-sponsored entities using these techniques could systematically destroy international cooperation for strategic advantage. Peace processes could be sabotaged to maintain regional conflicts. Trade agreements could be corrupted to create economic dependencies. Environmental accords that could have addressed climate change more effectively. All destroyed by the weaponization of my expertise. The good news is, Director Kellerman continued, that now that we understand how the system works, we can identify and neutralize compromised networks. The bad news is that the knowledge of how to do this is already spreading beyond our ability to contain it. Ambassador Hartwell, who had been quietly reviewing financial documents, looked up with a disturbing observation. According to these trading records, several major geopolitical crises in the past year show unusual financial activity in the days preceding their outbreak. Currency movements, commodity speculation, defense contractor activity, all suggesting that some people knew conflicts were about to emerge. "You're saying they might have been creating those conflicts?" Minister Volkov asked. "I'm saying the financial evidence suggests that someone has been profiting from geopolitical instability with remarkable consistency and precision. Either they've developed the world's most accurate prediction models, or they've been actively manufacturing the crises they profit from."
The room buzzed with urgent conversation as the full scope of what we were facing became clear. This wasn't just about exposing a single conspiracy. We were looking at a fundamental attack on the concept of international cooperation itself, a system designed to turn communication into miscommunication, understanding into suspicion, diplomacy into conflict. And somewhere in the conference hall below, David was still making phone calls, still trying to manage what he probably saw as a temporary setback in a profitable enterprise. He had no idea that what he had started with greed and family manipulation had grown into a threat to global stability itself. "Miss Voss," Director Kellerman said, her voice heavy with the weight of international authority, "we're going to need you to do more than just expose what your brother built. We're going to need you to help us understand how to rebuild what he's destroyed. Because right now, every international negotiation, every diplomatic communication, every attempt at peaceful cooperation is potentially compromised." Looking out at the delegates below, people who had come to Geneva in good faith to build economic cooperation, I realized that my fight wasn't just about justice for David's betrayal anymore. It was about restoring the possibility of international understanding itself. The question was whether we could act fast enough to prevent the complete collapse of diplomatic communication before the techniques David had helped perfect spread beyond our ability to counter them. In the 72 hours following the Geneva exposure, I learned what it meant to become a ghost in my own life. The international media had seized on the story with voracious intensity. Sister exposes brother's global conspiracy. Translator saves international relations. Family betrayal prevents economic war. My face was on every news channel, my voice quoted in every major newspaper, my story dissected by analysts who had never spent a day interpreting the subtle tensions that could make or break diplomatic relations. But fame, I discovered, was just another form of isolation. My phone rang constantly with interview requests I couldn't accept due to the ongoing investigation. Journalists camped outside my Geneva hotel, making it impossible to leave without facing a barrage of questions I wasn't authorized to answer. Social media exploded with opinions about my actions, some calling me a hero, others condemning me for destroying my family, many questioning whether I could be trusted given my role in enabling the conspiracy in the first place. The worst part was the silence from people who actually mattered to me. Colleagues from the International Diplomatic Corps avoided my calls, uncertain whether association with me would help or harm their careers. Friends who had known me for years suddenly seemed unsure how to relate to someone who had become a public figure overnight. The comfortable anonymity that had allowed me to do my job effectively was gone forever. David, meanwhile, had been released on bail pending trial, surrounded by a legal team that seemed to emerge from nowhere. He gave one interview to a financial news network, portraying himself as a victim of his sister's paranoid delusions and suggesting that my accusations were the result of professional jealousy and mental instability. The way he spoke about me, with practiced sadness rather than anger, was perhaps the most hurtful thing of all. Elena has always been brilliant with languages, but she's never understood the real world of international finance. I think the pressure of her position may have caused her to see conspiracies where none existed. Watching that interview alone in my hotel room, I felt the full weight of what I had sacrificed. Not just my relationship with David, but my sense of belonging anywhere. I was too controversial for the diplomatic community, too specialized for civilian life, too recognizable for the anonymity that had always been my refuge. The retaliation came in waves, each more sophisticated than the last. It started with professional pressure, questions about my mental stability, suggestions that I had violated diplomatic protocols, hints that my security clearance might be under review. Anonymous sources leaked stories about my erratic behavior and history of paranoid episodes, painting me as someone whose judgment couldn't be trusted. The financial pressure was more subtle but equally effective. Legal fees for defending against David's counter-accusations began draining my savings. My apartment lease was mysteriously terminated due to building violations that materialized overnight. Credit agencies suddenly found irregularities in my financial history that required extensive documentation to resolve. But the psychological pressure was the most devastating. I received calls at all hours, sometimes silence, sometimes voices warning me to reconsider my story, sometimes recordings of conversations I'd had with David years earlier, taken out of context to suggest that I had been planning this exposure for personal gain. My hotel room was broken into twice. Nothing stolen, but everything subtly moved, a clear message that nowhere was safe. Director Kellerman assigned me protective security, but even that created isolation. I couldn't maintain normal relationships when every interaction required security clearance. I couldn't work when every communication was potentially monitored. I couldn't build a future when my present was consumed by litigation and investigation. The worst moment came when I received a package containing photographs, pictures of me throughout my life, from childhood through my recent work in Geneva. The message was clear. They had been watching me for longer than I had realized, and they could reach me anywhere, anytime. The paranoia that David's legal team was trying to attribute to me became uncomfortably real.
The turning point came not from official investigation, but from an unexpected source. Dr. Yuki Nakamura, one of the translators I had suspected of involvement in the conspiracy, approached me through intermediaries requesting a meeting. She had been terrified into silence initially, but as evidence mounted and legal immunity was offered for cooperation, she decided to tell her story. We met in a secure facility outside Geneva, surrounded by international security personnel and legal observers. Dr. Nakamura, a woman I had respected for her linguistic precision and cultural sensitivity, looked exhausted and ashamed. "Elena," she said quietly, "I need you to understand that most of us didn't know what we were really doing. Dr. Brenner recruited us gradually, making it seem like research into cultural communication patterns. We thought we were helping improve international understanding." She explained how the recruitment had worked. Small requests for linguistic analysis, gradually escalating to requests for experimental translation techniques that were supposedly being tested for effectiveness. Only a few people at the top understood they were systematically sabotaging diplomatic communications. "But there's something else," Dr. Nakamura continued. "Something that might help you understand why this was so important to stop." She revealed that the conspiracy had been planning what they called Phase 3, the systematic corruption of crisis communication protocols. During international emergencies, when rapid and accurate communication could mean the difference between resolution and catastrophe, they were prepared to introduce chaos at the linguistic level. "Imagine," she said, "if during a nuclear crisis, the communication between world leaders was deliberately corrupted, if offers of de-escalation were translated as threats, if peaceful overtures were rendered as acts of war. Elena, they weren't just planning to destabilize trade negotiations, they were building the capability to turn diplomatic crises into actual conflicts." The evidence she provided included communication protocols for emergency translation services, plans for corrupting crisis hotlines between world leaders, and methodologies for ensuring that international emergency responses would be systematically miscommunicated. The scope was terrifying. The potential for manufactured international crises that could escalate beyond anyone's ability to control. Armed with Dr. Nakamura's evidence and testimony from 17 other corrupted translators who had agreed to cooperate, I requested one final meeting with David before his trial began. Director Kellerman arranged it in a secure facility, with full recording and legal oversight. David entered the room looking older than his 42 years old, his confidence replaced by the hollow expression of someone whose carefully constructed world had collapsed. We sat across from each other at a metal table, separated by more than just physical distance. "Hello, Elena," he said quietly. "I suppose you're here to gloat." "I'm here to understand," I replied. "I need to know why, David, why you were willing to risk war between nations for money." He was quiet for a long moment, staring at his hands. When he finally spoke, his voice carried none of its usual certainty. "Do you know what it's like to be the normal sibling? The one without special gifts, without prestigious careers, without the respect that comes from serving something larger than yourself?" I stared at him, confused by the direction of his response. "You were always the brilliant one, Elena. Multiple languages, prestigious positions, serving international peace. I was just a businessman, making money. Nothing noble, nothing special. So you decided to destroy what I'd built?" "I decided to prove that your world, this idealistic notion that words and understanding could solve international problems, was naive, that everything ultimately comes down to power and money, and that people like me, who understand that reality, would always win against people like you who believe in fairy tales about cooperation and mutual understanding." The bitter irony in his voice was unmistakable. "And when you started explaining to me how vulnerable the whole system was, how easily it could be manipulated, I realized I could prove my point and profit from it simultaneously." I felt a sadness that went deeper than anger. "David, do you understand what you almost caused? Phase 3 would have corrupted crisis communications between world leaders. You could have triggered actual wars."
For the first time, he looked genuinely surprised. Phase 3? Elena, I don't know what you're talking about. My involvement was purely financial. Currency speculation, volatility trading. I never planned anything involving military conflicts. The realization hit me like ice water. David had been a mid-level player in something much larger and more dangerous than even he had understood. The people who had recruited him, who had used his firm as a front, who had exploited his resentment and greed, they had never intended to stop at financial manipulation. David, I said quietly, you weren't the mastermind. You were a tool. And when Phase 3 was implemented, you would have been eliminated as a security risk, just like all the other expendable assets. The trials took 8 months and involved testimony from witnesses in 23 countries. The core conspiracy included 47 individuals, with David receiving a 15-year sentence for international financial fraud and conspiracy to destabilize diplomatic relations. Dr. Brenner was sentenced to 25 years for his role as the operational coordinator. But the real masterminds, the intelligence operatives who had designed Phase 3, remained shadows. Some were never identified. Others were beyond the reach of international prosecution, protected by states that benefited from global instability. The immediate impact was significant. Compromised translation services were identified and replaced, new security protocols were implemented for diplomatic communications, and international organizations established oversight committees to prevent future linguistic manipulation. The failed negotiations that had been sabotaged were reconvened with verified translation services, and many achieved the cooperation that had been artificially prevented. However, the deeper damage proved harder to repair. Trust in international communication had been shaken. Delegates now approached negotiations with heightened suspicion, wondering whether they were hearing accurate translations or subtle distortions. The paranoia that the conspiracy had sought to create had partially succeeded, even after exposure.
I testified before international tribunals, helped design new security protocols, and worked with linguistic specialists to develop detection systems for future manipulation attempts. But I also faced the reality that my career in diplomatic interpretation was effectively over. Too many people associated me with the scandal, and the intense media coverage made it impossible to return to the anonymity that effective interpretation required. 2 years after Geneva, I founded the International Communication Integrity Foundation, a nonprofit organization dedicated to protecting diplomatic language from manipulation and ensuring accurate cross-cultural communication during international negotiations. We work with governments, international organizations, and academic institutions to develop both technological and human safeguards against linguistic warfare. The irony is not lost on me that my life's work now involves protecting the very systems I had unknowingly helped to compromise. But perhaps that's the point. The people best equipped to defend against sophisticated attacks are those who understand how such attacks work. I receive letters regularly from translators, diplomats, and peace negotiators who tell me that our training and protocols have helped them identify and prevent communication manipulation. We've documented 17 attempts to corrupt international negotiations using variations of the techniques David's network had developed, and in each case, our safeguards enabled accurate communication to prevail. The foundation has grown to include a crisis response team that provides verified translation services during international emergencies, ensuring that when world leaders need to communicate during crises, their words carry precisely the meanings they intend. We've prevented 3 major diplomatic misunderstandings that could have escalated into serious international incidents. David and I have no relationship now. He's serving his sentence in a federal facility that specializes in white-collar criminals, and I understand from family friends that he maintains his innocence and continues to blame me for destroying his life. I've made peace with that reality. Some relationships cannot survive the collision between love and truth. But I've found new relationships built on shared commitment to international understanding. My colleagues at the foundation come from every continent and speak dozens of languages among us.
We work together not because we share blood or history, but because we share a belief that accurate communication is the foundation of peaceful coexistence. Sometimes I stand at my office window, looking out at the United Nations building in New York, and I think about that moment in Geneva when I had to choose between family loyalty and global responsibility. I think about the 43 negotiations that had been corrupted, the peace processes that had failed, the human suffering that had resulted from manufactured miscommunication. And I think about the letters we received from negotiators who successfully prevented conflicts because they had the tools to detect linguistic manipulation. Children who are growing up in peace because diplomatic solutions were allowed to succeed. Trade agreements that are lifting communities out of poverty because economic cooperation was no longer being artificially sabotaged. David called me just a translator, someone who merely repeated what other people said. He never understood that translation isn't about repetition, it's about trust. It's about the faith that when someone speaks words of peace, cooperation, or understanding, those words will reach their intended audience with their meaning intact. In the end, I learned that 12 languages spoken with integrity are more powerful than any conspiracy built on greed and manipulation. Words, when they carry truth across cultural divides, have the power to build bridges that no amount of financial profit can destroy. The battle for accurate international communication continues every day, but now I fight it with full knowledge of what we're defending against. And every successful negotiation, every prevented conflict, every moment of genuine understanding between nations proves that the work we do matters. My brother saw languages as vulnerabilities to exploit. I've dedicated my life to proving they are strengths to protect. And in that difference lies the distinction between those who would divide the world and those who would unite it. In the end, that distinction makes all the difference.
Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hits the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to like, subscribe, and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.